Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we are going to be kicking off our Paradox Rift content with the impact of Paradox Rift. Today we're going to be talking about the current decks that we know of in the game and how they can be adapting and changing with the new inclusions from Paradox Rift. This set is monstrous, to be honest with you. We have a lot of cards that are versatile, could go into many archetypes, and we have some new archetypes budding from this set, which could also challenge some of the decks we already know in the game. So I am expecting a big shift from our previous format into this new one. The Paradox Rift expansion is released on the 4th of November and will be legal for tournament play for the Latin American International Championships, so less than a month away for players to start building these decks. And what is truly intriguing about Paradox Rift for the first time in a while here is that we are receiving our set basically at the same time as Japan receives their Future Flash and Ancient Raw sets themselves, so we don't really have much to go on. It's really going to be our own playtesting this time around that is going to dictate how well the decks end up being constructed, because we have far less of a baseline to go off of. So I feel like there's all sorts of chaos going on right now when I hear people talking about certain archetypes, which are going to be strong, which are weak, how powerful cards are going to be. It feels like the Wild West. So hopefully my own playtesting is going to come into play here, where I can hopefully be confident about what we're talking about today. First of all, let's talk about the pre-Paradox Rift meta. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen, it's the points accumulated from archetypes in the Obsidian Flames format as well as the 151 format. This is kind of combining the two to see what's most successful, and it's very much mirrored in the online data over the last month or so. So not too much surprising here. We're going to be trying to cover the top archetypes that you can see in front of you and how they're going to be adapting in this new format. But first, I did just want to touch on the new contenders of the meta. You can see on the left-hand side of the screen the big, scary Iron Hands EX, that amp you very much attack. Although it sounds like a joke with the attack name itself, it's certainly one that you have to respect, and there can be many decks today that we'll talk about that will include this card. And I think it's really important to know that this is a factor for some archetypes, because it can really change how prize mapping works in games. Sometimes using a single prize attacker is no longer all that helpful for you if your opponent is able to simply burst an Iron Hands EX onto the scene. Also, the downsides of a Luminion V or a Squawkabilly EX or a Pidgeot EX, these sorts of cards are amplified because there is an Iron Hands that could potentially take a 3's prize knockout on your Pokemon. So these are all things that when deck building we have to be much more aware of just in general. Even though Iron Hands EX isn't going to be just its own attacker, its own deck where you just use this every single turn of the game, it's going to be a bit part player in archetypes where there will be moments in games where it can change the course of a prize map and be a very powerful card. I have played a decent amount with Iron Hands and I do think it's going to be a successful card in the game, but it's not going to be that doomsday moment. In terms of like brand new archetypes, Roaring Moon with the Professor Sada's Vitality just seems like a really good racing archetype. Roaring Moon EX has an instant knockout attack in that Frenzied Gouging, so you can immediately reach on even, Stage 2 EX Pokemon or VMAX Pokemon. We have Calamity Storm in there as well, which makes it very able to deal with single prize Pokemon quite happily, as well as just racing on basic EX or V Pokemon as well. So this one attacker has answers to pretty much every type of Pokemon that you'll be facing up against. So it feels like a turbo Roaring Moon deck with probably Squawkabilly, with Radiant Greninja, with Sardas and Dark Patch. It's just going to be a very solid, trying to take a 2-prize map game plan every single turn of the game that just seems like good right now, to be honest with you, because it has so much versatility. So I'm pretty certain there will be quite a low to the ground fast archetype, similar to like a Miraidon that we see right now, where you're using mostly 2-prize Pokemon, probably have one single prizer that can offset a prize race, but is going to just be hard, fast, and coming out the blocks quickly to disrupt and certainly take multi-prize turns in the best case scenario. Then we have Iron Valiant EX. This is a really impressive card. The Tachyon Bits is certainly an ability to keep note of. When this Pokemon comes into the active position, you can put 2 counters on one of your opponent's Pokemon. It doesn't sound like much, only 2 counters being thrown around, but of course we can use multiple Iron Valiant EX, and there possibly are going to be some Donk style builds where we have multiple Iron Valiants, you have Medicham Yoga Loop plays in the deck as well, similar to the Rapid Strike toolbox that we know right now with Inteleon VMAX, but simply cutting those out of the deck list and going for Iron Valiant EX instead with a ton of switch outs, so you can possibly even Yoga Loop as early as turn 1 if you've been able to, squawkably research, see a ton of cards, get that combo rolling. Could be very dangerous for evolving decks where we have many 60 hit points and 70 hit point Pokemon around on the board right now, and simply removing these from play with an early Tachyon Bits combo could be really scary. It's probably going to be quite a fragile archetype because you only really have space for like a 2/2 line of Urshifu and a Medicham itself as attackers, and you just use the Iron Valiant's ability the entire game. So it's going to be quite a fragile archetype, but could also have some big wombo combos that we have to be aware of and know that if we are playing these evolution decks, you have to really prepare for just some early Tachyon Bits combinations, especially because if the Iron Valiant happens to go first and you only need a single, 70 hit point Pokemon, it doesn't take a huge amount for them to actually KO you, so they can actually get the job done before you've even drawn a card. So certainly a scary card in the game. Also, the Xatu from this set, it provides great energy acceleration as well as card draw in a single prize Pokemon and works very well for Psychic Pokemon. It attaches a Psych Energy to one of your benched Pokemon and then you draw 2 cards, so it's pretty much the exact same as Shadow Rider VMAX, except it can also attach energy to non-psychic types, so there is even more versatility potentially with these sort of Xatu toolboxes. I feel like Iron Valiant EX is kind of the best partner again in that archetype. You could open the door for the Laser Blade to be a fantastic attack. Iron Valiant is actually a good attacker in the game, so especially with the Future Booster Energy Capsule, you push that Laser Blade up to 220, which is, as we know, a really good threshold, but with Tachyon Bits on top of that, we can even start reaching on higher hit point Pokemon over an accumulation of turns, or if you've been able to Tachyon Bits multiple times in a turn, that could be huge. But then at the same time, into single prize matchups, you have these Tachyon Bits that can take out lower hit point engine Pokemon, certainly, to take additional, mid-turn prize cards. So I do believe that Iron Valiant is going to be a very successful card if we expect lots of evolution decks to still be in the meta. Currently in the meta, there's a ton of evolution decks. There's Chien-Pao, there's Guardy, there's Charizard, even like Comfey-based engines with such low hit point Pokemon around. I feel like Iron Valiant's going to have a good time into most of those things. So I think this is going to be the archetype, actually, the sort of Xatu deck and the Urshifu deck. I feel like these are the most meta warping cards in the game just because of that ability to steal games away from people by instantly removing an engine Pokemon, and maybe they even get 2 turns out of it, that sort of thing. So low-key, I'm more of a doomsdayer about Iron Valiant EX than I am about Iron Hands EX. I think they're both very powerful cards, but in terms of warping the metagame as we know it, I feel like Valiant might be the key catalyst in the game. So I'm a big believer in both of these builds, and we are going to be showing all of these brand new deck lists on the channel over the next coming days. We've got the set list in a couple days' time, and we have lots of IRL gameplay coming very soon. Goldengo EX just seems to be a very good Stage 1 Pokemon. It has the combination of draw power and a one-hit KO attacking option for just 1 energy attachment. When you say it out loud, it sounds absolutely insane. It's kind of a throwback to Slurpuff with its ability. It's a throwback to Fireball Circus Percephalon in terms of its attack, and those are all successful cards in the past, and munching this all into one EX Pokemon seems very powerful. We know that we have the Evolutor Arven combo in the game. There's also an Irida package, which I'm super interested in and have really been enjoying playing. So I feel like even though it is an ability-based EX deck, and we know that Path of the Peak is always going to shut down a ton of these more interesting and explosive archetypes, I do feel like there are ways around the Path of the Peak, and you have so much internal draw with this deck. I do think Goldengo is going to be another great racing deck into multi-prize matchups, but of course you represent a single prize board state for the first turn of the game because you just have, single prize Gimme Ghoul and such, so that can naturally put you on a pretty nice prize race against some of, the likes of Roaring Moon, the likes of Miraidon, these sorts of archetypes, even some of the Iron Valiant variants, as long as your Gimme Ghouls aren't all knocked out immediately. I think this could be a really, really powerful card as well. There are a couple interesting stage 2s from this set as well. Garchomp has some great energy acceleration, and it provides fighting energy acceleration. We know that fighting's a decent type right now. It can at least combat Iron Hands quite well and Miraidon quite well. It also covers Garchomp's own lightning weakness, so I think you're actually pretty okay into other lightning decks because you're probably playing some fighting stuff yourself. I've seen it a lot of the time alongside the single prize Lucario, but there's also potential to play this with Urshifu VMAX, and I feel like that could be interesting, where we've seen an Irida package work well with Cross Switch Cologne with Greninja, of course, but if we have Cross-Switcher Cologne with Urshifu in an Irida package, I also think that has potential in a Garchomp deck. It's something that we've built fairly early as well, so I think that has some potential. But of course, to be a Stage 2 that's successful in the game, you have to be as good as Gardevoir or as good as Charizard, and I think Garchomp sits a little bit below that bar, so I would expect this to see a little bit less play than those other EXs. I feel like it could kind of be on the outside looking in, but it does still have a decent amount of potential behind it. Same for Skeledirge EX, really. That metal typing is surprisingly quite good, because I do expect Valiant to be popular, and it's also good into the Chem Power matchup, where you have a pretty solid weakness to boast and you have high hit points. You're at least forcing a ton of resources out of the opponents. But there are a few hoops that you have to jump through to get the Skeledirge EX working. Its Incendiary Song ability forces you to discard a basic fire energy from the hand in order to use its ability, and then the attacks of your Pokemon do 60 more damage to your opponent's active Pokemon. Actually kind of reminds me of Meowscarada EX, where it's a Stage 2 Pokemon, its attack is like fine, and its ability is also kind of good, but it's just so many steps to get this Stage 2 working, and then even once you've got the EX into play, you then also have to spend more resources from the hand. The upside of discarding Fire Energy, of course, is that we have Magma Basin, and we have sort of a fire toolbox of attackers that we can get working. That 60 damage buff can be really crucial for Entei, it can be really crucial for Radiant Charizard, so I can see how a prize race comes together for Skeledirge, but it's still going to be a lot of work to get this archetype going. Then a quick note on Clorf Brute Bonnet. I feel like it could potentially be another new single prize attacking deck in the game. Clorf has that fighting type coverage, which might help this archetype actually just remain prevalent, because I do think single prizes will struggle if there is a ton of Iron Hands in the game and a ton of Iron Valiant in the game, because they both prey on lower hit point single prizes. But Clorf is a high enough hit point single prize Pokemon that also has type coverage into Iron Hands, so you're at least trading evenly against them. And typically Iron Hands is quite a resource intensive card to develop, so it's much more difficult for them to rinse and repeat that. So there could be a combination where Clorf is just a decent high damage single prize mon, and even if you have like a Radiant Charizard endgame, something like that, it could come together fairly nicely. I feel like this is one of the more fringe ones and may never see the light of day, because it is, you know, combo based and you are relying on finding double turbos and such. And you might even need to have additional damage modifiers like Radiant Sneasler and stuff like that. So that one's more out there, I'll be the first to admit that, but I did just want to mention it on the slide because I have seen some talk about it. Now, the video actually isn't all about all this new stuff, even though I've talked about it for a good few minutes now. We're going to start focusing with this context on the current best performers in the game and how they're going to be adapting. Starting with Lost Zone box then, a couple of really interesting EX Pokemon could be coming into the deck list. Iron Valiant has a Psychic Energy attack cost with one colorless, so could easily make its way into gate builds of Lost Zone box where you are already playing Psychic Energy in decent counts because you already have Sableye, so it could neaten up your energy counts possibly, where you have now Iron Valiant reaching that 220 threshold into the active position if you need it to be with Tachyon bits, or it can be dealing 200 into the active and also have additional counters that you can throw around to mop up with Sableye later, for example, or even put things into Radiant Greninja range, that sort of thing. So Valiant seems to have a decent amount of synergy with Lost Box. The one sort of caveat would be that you're probably only putting like one tech Valiant into the deck, two maximum really, because your board space is so taken up by your Manaphy, your Greninja, your Comphase. You're really just weaving in the Iron Valiant as essentially an alternative to one of your V-attacking Pokemon, but I do think it has great synergy with Sableye, so definitely something that I'm going to pay attention to. A similar thing here with Iron Hands EX. Again, we have Mirage Gate, so you can't write off the fact that you could use Ampy very much all in one turn. We've seen Raihan-based builds of Lost Box in the past, being that secondary supporter alongside your Colress, and I think that could work really well with Iron Hands, where you go turn attachment, Gate, Raihan, Ampy very much, and take out some other single prize Pokemon. Could be huge for mirror match situations and completely warp the context of what's going on, where Sableye was usually the best way to sort of take 1.5 prizes a turn, and Iron Hands can easily just take 2 prizes immediately and force more 2 prizes onto the Lost Zone box player's board for then you to continue on a 2 prize map the entire game. So I think the Iron Hands could be very good for that. It also gives you a better time into Lugia, which was one of your worst matchups as Lost Zone box, because they just had really chunky single prize Pokemon, and they had obviously the Lugia, which sits out of range of a lot of your attackers. counters, so an Iron Hands could be flipping that Lugia matchup, which was kind of one of the only checks to Lost Box in the game right now. There's a Technical Machine Devolution, which could be pretty interesting. We know that Sableye likes to get sneaky with damage counters. Cramorant gets some early pokes in there, so having a Devolve package could be really good for the likes of the Charizard matchup, and of course Gardevoir, so that could be a pretty nice tech inclusion, especially if we go down like possibly even a Town Store approach where we already have Forest Hill Stone, we have this TM, maybe even if you want to get sneaky with some of the future stuff and you get the Booster Energy Capsule in there as well. We could have a mini package going on with a variety of tools. Personally, I think the Devolution's not going to be that required because I already feel like the Iron Hands and the Valiant put enough pressure on Evolution decks that we're not going to need this TM to be in Lost Box. It's just kind of a dead slot a lot of the time, but it is definitely an option to have there. And then there's Jirachi, could easily be going into our deck list, protecting us in mirror match situations, protecting us from Yoga Loop as well. I've already mentioned the Valiant combo decks can actually be pretty massive, even protects against things like Shadow Rider V doing 250 damage spreads, which could be in the Xatu deck because you have so many Tachyon bits. You could be throwing the 2s around, then the Shadow Rider comes in and finishes 2 Pokemon off that have 70 hit points so easily. A Jirachi will help you block that, so I think that's pretty important. As for threats, Jirachi is obviously a huge headache for Lost Box. It can block Sableye, playing around with its damage counters, and I think that's a huge headache for the archetype if people want to tech for you, and I feel like certainly Gardevoir, certainly Charizard, and a ton of other archetypes have license to add a Jirachi into their deck list. It's going to really make that sort of mid-game, late-game Sableye spam where you maintain a single prize board state far less viable. It just is taken away from you if your opponent is able to establish that Jirachi. They probably need to have it alongside the Manaphy as well, so that you can't simply Greninja the Jirachi off the board. So it is taking up a few bench spaces for the opponent, but that's always an option, and the timing of this Jirachi can be the thing that's most important, where they can just use it at the right time or rod it back and have a moment for it to come into play where it completely scuppers your plans in the late game. And I think that's something that Lost Box hasn't really had to deal with before. And I also think as good as the future Pokemon are in Lost Box, I feel like they could also be big challenges for Lost Box. I feel like certainly Miraidon, where there's going to be an Iron Hands EX with possibly a Bravery Charm in the worst case scenario, could be hell for you to deal with, because obviously you then sit out of range of Dragonite as well. Iron Valiant decks as well could also be a big problem where they're going to be cashing in on your Comphase that have low hit points. Yes, Lost Box plays quad switch cart, so there's going to be some intricate math going on where you're undoing as much as you can versus how much they can throw onto the board, but I do think that's another challenge for the deck. The last note I wanted to touch on here is that in order to combat Jirachi Manaphy packages that people go into their deck, you could start thinking about Avery being a secondary supporter in Lost Box, so that you then give them that really tough decision of saying, hey, if you really want to have this Jirachi Manaphy down, you're going to have to pay for it and basically just have 2 attackers set up and nothing else on your board other than those tech inclusions, because it could really put your opponent into weird positions throughout the game. So that could be another turning point for Lost Box where we get that new secondary supporter. We've seen Roxanne in the past, we've seen Iono, we've seen Raihan, these sorts of things. There's no reason why Avery couldn't be that draw 3 option that also unlocks the board once again from Stellar Veil. So that's something to bear in mind for Lost Zone Box. Onto Lugia Archeops, a really interesting one for the archetype where we've seen Colorless do really well as of late, and I feel like Iron Hands with Earthen Vessel could easily make it into that approach where we have still a number of Snorlax which can offset the prize race against decks. So that could be pretty reasonable where you have a decent amount of single prize Pokemon, but then you also have this Iron Hands which can really put the pressure on if you have been able to summon turn 2. Earthen Vessel is just a good card in Lugia anyway. We're always looking to find ways to discard our Archeops, so even if you just have 2 copies of this card, it's like playing Quick Balls once again. It can also tutor the basic Lightning Energy out of the deck for you to attack with Iron Hands EX. So giving yourself some extra discard Archeops synergy whilst giving yourself Stoutland, essentially, coming back into the deck. We know how good and oppressive the Silver Tempest Lugia deck was, so I don't see why that combination can't work all over again. The threats, however, for Lugia is that other decks can be playing Iron Hands, and Ampy very much is really good at taking a 2-prize knockout onto Archeops with that weakness, so that's certainly a concern. And even just the arm press for 160 is a solid threshold, especially because Iron Hands has 230 hit points, so a Lugia can't simply come back and respond KO, which might even lead people down the avenue of going back towards a single strike approach where then you have like Stonjourner and such. But that's a whole avenue of what Lugia has to do in the next format. If there are Iron Hands EX techs, that's going to be a real problem for the deck. And I also think Goldengo is actually a tricky matchup as well. That 260 threshold again is really quite annoying for the Lugia players to get through, so something that the Lugia is going to have to adapt to, because they have easy one-hit KO potential and their Pokemon sit nicely out of range of all of your 2-prize Pokemon. They're probably not going to allow a Weirdeer to get frisky because they'll be going through the active so often, and even though though it has that fire weakness and a Radiant Charizard can get into the mix, if you're not really hand disrupting plus using Path against Goldengo, they'll be able to find routes where they're keeping on 2 prize maps most of the time. And I think that's a bit of a concern for the Lugia players, because even if Lugia goes first, gets to summon, all they're able to do is take a single prize knockout on like a Gimmighoul or like a Basculin or whatever other Pokemon they have in the act position. So yeah, I think that's going to be a challenging race against the Goldengo EX players. On to Gardevoir. This is one of the most interesting ones, because I feel like Gardevoir gains so much, but also has so many threats coming out all in one set. Suddenly we have a counter to Sableye, which I think is massive for the archetype. Also, we didn't really enjoy coming up against Rapid Strike based decks, so having this Jirachi to protect against Yoga Loop is actually huge as well. We gain the counter catcher. We've seen that Gardevoir is great at playing from behind. Oftentimes it gives up 2 turns before starting to launch attacks back at opponents, so giving yourself counter catcher as an option alongside Iono allows you to have more draw to hit your Gust, which is of course one thing, so you're still developing your board in the first place, but also means you can do more powerful things like Gust and Engine Mon whilst using an Iono at the same time, and that can be absolutely massive for this archetype. It actually could be a reason why we start seeing some Arven-based builds of Guardy, because Arven could convert into essentially a boss's orders, with Counter Catcher being the choice from that supporter card in the mid-game, as well as being like a really exceptional early game supporter for VIP Pass plus TM Evolution, so you can immediately get double Curlier developed. It could also be used to grab Forest Seal Stone throughout the game. We've seen that combined with Gardevoir in the past, so I do feel like there could easily be some Arven offshoots of Guardy going ahead to get your Pokemon evolved as quickly as possible. Professor Churro's Scenario, also a really interesting supporter card. We have seen things like Penny in the past, but having this new supporter card is much more versatile because, of course, it can be used on your Gardevoir EX, so there will be some matchups where Guardy is just a really nice tank, and you're using this just to get through single prize Pokemon and whatnot, and then you have this means of picking up your Gardevoir. It means you get trapped that little bit less in less matchups, but it also means you finally have some really nice healing. And the big upside of Churro's Scenario is that you, of course, discard all cards attached to the Pokemon, so the Psychic Energy don't get trapped in the hand like they would if you were using a Penny supporter. So that's a really solid include. Don't know if it actually makes the space into Gardevoir, but is another great option for the archetype. And finally, Iron Valiant EX is actually a really interesting one as well. We know that Gardevoir typically has to ramp like 6 or so energies into the discard pile to really start mounting a comeback in the game, but giving yourself an Iron Valiant EX option means that you only need to have 3 Psychics in your bin to start threatening KOs on 220 hit point Pokemon, because of course you can come in with that Laser Blade plus Tachyon Bits when it's coming into the active position, so it could give you an alternate attacker, plus having Tachyon Bits, if it's not required for the active position, can be putting other Pokemon in range. We know that of course Shining Arcana sits at that 270 threshold if you're doing a turn attachment plus 6 Embraces, so being able to Tachyon Bits onto 280 hit point Pokemon, set them up for KOs over future turns, you can allow yourself to have easier prize maps later on in the game. So the Iron Valiant could go alongside the likes of Cress and Zacian as just another basic attacking Mon to give you really high turn 2 tempo actually, which is a super interesting concept that I haven't seen much talk about so far, and mostly because Iron Valiant is actually a big threat for Gardevoir. We've seen that you'd love to heavily damage your Pokemon, and Iron Valiant is very, very good at cashing in on low hit point Pokemon. It's going to loop you. Even if there is a Jirachi on the board, they can sometimes bits their way through the Jirachi, then have Yoga Loops throughout the remainder of the game, which could be terrifying for you. And of course, then there's the other future Pokemon, which seems to be another issue for the archetype, where there may be situations where Iron Hands is simply swinging turn 2 in certain decks like Lugia, Chien-Pao, Miraidon, if they've all gone first against Degardi, and if they just come in with an Amp You Very Much through any of your Pokemon, suddenly you have a huge issue. And if the Iron Hands isn't immediately dealt with like double rare candy plays plus, you know, finding your reversal energy, the Iron Hand sits on board for another turn, then goes, you know, down to 2 prize cards left, and suddenly it's a huge challenge for Gardevoir to even create a comeback from that position. So Iron Hands is definitely a concern for Gardevoir. How consistent is that turn 2 Iron Hands play for the likes of Lugia, for the likes of Chien-Pao? That's really for us to decide whether or not Gardevoir is even playable anymore, to be honest with you. I feel like although Gardevoir Gala is one of the best archetypes in the game right now, pre-Paradox Rift. It is one of the most fragile. We know that there is Valiants and Hands both can create a huge hurdle for this archetype to overcome. And again, that TM devolution, just another thing that could be a huge issue for Guardi players, because you are so committed to damaging your own Pokemon that a devolution at the right time could completely ruin your board, whilst also disrupting like the rare candy plays you made in the mid game and such. It could completely swing a board state out of your favor. Onto Charizard EX, similar to Guardi in many ways, where we have this Jirachi, which is going to be a fantastic safeguard against Sableye and Yogaloop. It feels like Charizard is actually one of the decks that has the most liberal board space, because you oftentimes make like 1 or 2 Charizards, 1 Pidgeot, and the rest is kind of floating on your board, so having Jirachi Manaphy shouldn't be too difficult for you at all, and you obviously have great tutor for this with the Pidgeot itself. Countercatcher seems to fit in like a glove in this deck, seeing as though you're already playing a really high count of Arven, and you are oftentimes playing from behind, especially with your lower damage output in the earlier stages of the game, and it's late game when you become such a threat. So having this Countercatcher just seems like a no-brainer in Charizard going forward. Iron Hands EX, kind of more out there, I would say, but is an option where if you are playing Earthen Vessel, or even if you just play things like Luminous Energy in the deck list, we have Pidgeot that can tutor parts of this combination. So if you evolve into a Charizard attach 3 Fire to Iron Hands, then use your turn attachment to fulfill that lightning attack cost, suddenly you can be swinging with an Iron Hands. I think it's actually quite combo orientated to make that happen in a Charizard deck, but I did just want to give the nod to Iron Hands because it is such a versatile attacker. It could end up making it into the deck if you feel like there are enough lower hit point archetypes running around in the game. However, as good as Iron Hands is, once again, it's still a concern for this archetype. Not only do you have lower hit point Pokemon that could give up 2 prize cards in the opening stages of the game if the opponent's gone first into you, but also you, of course, are looking to have that Pidgeot EX on the board, and if at any time your opponent can make a gust play happen, they can be cashing in and taking 3 prize cards against you. You even use Luminion a lot with this deck, and that's another way that Iron Hands could take a 3 prize knockout against you, and that's obviously really difficult for Charizard to overcome, especially if they've just taken an early prize card going first or whatever on turn 2, then they have an Iron Hands 3 prize play. Typically that means they need to get through 1 Charizard, and that's not always too difficult for some of these archetypes, so this could be really awkward for Charizard, because the highlights, the main payoff of this archetype is that you're making your opponent have these awkward prize maps where Charizard is just such a bulky, annoying dude to get through, whereas this Iron Hands can allow archetypes to circumvent that prize trade that little bit in their favor. TM Devolution, also a really scary card. You are super rare candy focused. You play no middle evolution for Pidgeot. You only play 1 Charmeleon, so a Devolution is basically always backbreaking for you, especially if your opponent is combining it with like an Iono or something in the mid to late game, and that's going to be horrendous for this deck because, yeah, you are limited to your 4 candies, and if that doesn't come together, if that doesn't get you over the line from there, you're in a huge amount of trouble. I'd also say that Roaring Moon EX is pretty good against this archetype. It can use Calamity Storm early on and still stay out of range of a Charizard on the backswing, even with a Vitality Band, which would be really scary. And then, of course, the Frenzied Gouging can get through Charizards as well. So as long as they're powering up multiple Roaring Moon, they should have a really easy way of racing into you, because, again, the high hit points of the Charizard is really nullified by this gouging attack. So I would say that's another really challenging matchup for this deck coming out from the new set. Onto Mew VVAX, a couple of interesting ones, actually. TM Devolution could be a tech card for Charizard. We know that's one of the main things keeping Mew at bay as of right now, so having this option alongside Judge Path could be really helpful to just stop the Charizard hitting you altogether, and can allow you to slowly creep back into a prize race by picking apart pieces of their board. Certainly getting through their few Charmanders and whatnot could be pretty reasonable. Even if you've gone down a number of prize cards, you can make that comeback with this hero play. Speaking of comebacks, Countercatcher could be pretty reasonable in the deck. It's just another item card to help with your ratios in the worst case scenario, but also if we are focusing more so on using Judge or Iono throughout the game, you now have Gust as well. I remember in early renditions of DTU Mew, there were cross-switcher based builds, and it feels like a Countercatcher is a much less intensive in terms of space option that then gives you a great Gust play. And when you're already playing Forest Seal Stones, when you're already playing Cramomatics, this feels like a great card to cherry pick for the right moments in a game, to take out Engine Mons alongside a Hand Disruptor, or just make sure you're on the right prize map the entire game, which is phenomenal. The one thing I will say is that Roaring Moon Moon does look to be a really promising racing archetype. It's a dark type deck, and it has really high hit points as well. If you are putting a tool onto your Roaring Moon, it's a 290 hit point to your prize Pokemon. That's dark type, that's just bursting through you, whilst also even like removing paths from play naturally with its Calamity Storm attack. So there's so many reasons why it basically doesn't care about Mew, which is really worrying for this archetype. So if Roaring Moon does start hitting that key threshold, that tipping point of being one of the more popular decks in the game, I think Roaring Moon plus Charizard plus all the tech cards that we finally have in the game, there surely is a way that Mew struggles here and has to dodge and weave a number of matchups. I'm never going to say Mew is dead, because we've seen time and time again that it is proven false, but I do think there's just more challenges coming out from the new set. I'd also say to a lesser extent, Goldengo EX sort of fits that role as well. It's a 2-prize mon that can uptrade quite nicely. We've seen that Mew can handle the Chien-Pao matchup just from Judge Path, and that could still end up being the case into Goldengo. But the one thing I will say is that it has much more onboard draw, so as soon as Goldengo does find a Stadium Bounce, it then just immediately swings the game and can take big uptrades. So I do think a Judge Path strategy is probably the way I want to be playing Mew going into the new set. Feels like the safest option, but there are always upswings with the Fusion build as well. I think going into the format, however, I would be looking to use a disruptive build of Mew as my first port of call. On to Miraidon Flaffy. There are a couple of great Lightning type EXs in this set. Iron Hands, of course, being one of the primary ones, and I do think this makes Miraidon one of the more scary archetypes in the game now that you're able to go first and simply get a ton attachment onto Iron Hands. Even if you don't play any generators, there's that threat of a turn 2 amp you very much with, you know, a Flaffy coming into play plus a generator hit plus a turn attachment. That means suddenly they're taking 2-prize knockouts. Yes, they're using a 2-prize Pokemon to do it, but this is an archetype that can play Bravery Charms, which is certainly scary, where the Iron Hands are just really difficult to get through for a number of archetypes. And again, just that 230 hit point threshold is so frustrating for many archetypes to get through. I do think that its attack cost is pretty steep, however, so adding in the likes of Raihan, the likes of EXP Share, possibly even DTE to amp you very much a little bit cheaper, these could all be cards that come into the Miraidon deck so that you have easier ways of using this attacker. Similarly, with that Turbo Energized TM, that could also be a great way that you throw a single prize Pokemon into the active. We've seen the likes of Zeraora as a free retreat tech option. We've seen Mareep already in the deck. You could easily get these out with Miraidon, switch into them, turn attached to one of those Pokemon, and Turbo Energize onto an Iron Hands. That also seems like a really scary situation where many decks aren't equipped to go for a turn 2 boss's orders because they're so focused on their own setup. Looking at the stage 2 archetypes, looking at Lugia, these decks typically have to play other supporters other than boss's orders. Even the Lost Zone decks often have to do the same thing. So having an Iron Hands just chilling on the bench isn't actually the worst play you can make with this deck, because as the game develops with more generator hits, with more Flaffies and such being developed, you will have that surplus of energy to be able to weave in this Iron Hands to have more favourable prize trades. So another thing to bear in mind for the Arven toolkit there, really. Countercatcher seems like a weird one, but if you are playing a couple Arven, it could be okay. And again, if you're going down this direction of having Turbo Energize as one of your plays, it's not crazy to go down a prize pretty early, but also, even if you're being the aggressor, you get in there with a Raikou, just take a single prize knockout to initiate a prize race, your opponent immediately comes back on that Raikou, suddenly they're a prize up on you and you have countercatcher plays at your disposal. So I do think, even though we are one of the more aggressive decks in the game, because we are often using 2 prize card Pokemon out the gate, countercatcher could find some avenues to be a reasonable card when we are playing a couple Arven in the deck list. And even again with Forest Hill Stone as an option, there's always that play that you have available to you. What I also think is interesting is that this deck is one of the better Judge decks in the game. It's often playing 3 Path, 2 Judge, 2 Iono, that sort of thing, and I think it's just really powerful in the game right now. I feel like Judge Path is just not in a number of the new archetypes, so that means that the existing archetypes kind of have to take that mantle on and make sure that we're keeping these decks in check, and that if you can catch them on bad hands, their wacky combos aren't really going to come off too much. So I think the Tapu Koko really fits that role quite nicely, because it has an inbuilt paralysis option. If one of your Pokemon were knocked out during your opponent's last turn, you deal 120 and instantly paralyze their active. So combining a Judge Path combination with a Tapu Koko doesn't seem too difficult. It's just a lightning colorless attack cost, so you can just get it out with a Miraidon, turn attached to it, Flaffy to it, suddenly you have the paralysis play, similar to how Pikarom back in the day always had its Raichu paralysis 2-shot option into the higher hit point Pokemon, like the Charizards, possibly even into a Gardevoir if you can bring it up and then just hit it with a Revenge Shock, maybe even into things like Roaring Moon or Goldengo where they have higher hit points. You can try and set up a 2-hit KO either with like a Raichu on the follow-up or even just with an Iron Hands on the follow-up and take a 3 prize turn over 2 hits where your opponent doesn't actually hit you back, that can be a great way for you to get back into a race. So I think low-key that a Judge Path build of Miraidon may end up being more successful than a Turbo Hands build, because the Turbo Hands really is quite an all-in play, because you are committing so much to the initial Iron Hands. If it doesn't stick on the board, or if your opponent just blows it up or whatever, you could end up just having a bit of a drought in the mid-game, whereas the Coco seems to be a much more stable late-game play. We have the very efficient attacks of the Raikou that can come in, the Miraidon can get into the action, but then having this Coco slow the game down with a Judge Path play could give you a really solid late-game option. So that's something I really want to explore with the deck and think it's solid. As for threats, the Roaring Moon and the Goldengo, these are other racing archetypes. Goldengo, of course, represents a single prize board for a turn, so naturally it's the Raikou getting into the mix early, and then you can sometimes have a unfavorable prize trade, and they sit out of range of Miraidon and Raikou quite happily, so it's a little bit awkward. It would be quite resource intensive to ride you through a couple of Goldengos, so that seems like a bit of an issue for you. And Roaring Moon as well, it can sit outside of your range quite well with that 230 baseline. Calamity Storm allows them to hit 220 very well, and again mops the paths off the board, so your disruption isn't all that valid either. So I do think those are some challenging racing decks for this one, so something to bear in mind. And if Clawfeather kicks on, that's also going to be a feels bad matchup. Onto Lost Zone Giratina, also gaining a few really interesting cards. Iron Valiant could be a tech attacker, like I mentioned in the Lost Zone box variant. It works pretty well when we're already playing Psych Energy and Mirage Gate, and that Tachyon Bits fits really nicely alongside Sableye, but also allows Giratina to play some single prize board states, knowing that you have Laser Blade as a burst potential attack, similar to how Lost Box can represent single prize board states and then just get a Dragonite out of nowhere. Having a Valiant could be a really versatile option that fits nicely with Giratina's existing energy counts. There's also Jirachi, which could be nice in the mirror matches. We know that Giratina was slightly unfavored into Lost Box more often than not, but it also helps you out against Yoga Loop, where, again, I'm terrified of that combination alongside Valiant, so I'm going to keep beating that drum the entire video, I think. So having some protection there seems valid. I also think Countercatcher is massive. I've already seen Japan talking a lot about Tina. They love playing Tina out in Japan. It's always been in their sort of top 3 of archetypes over the last few months, without a doubt, and I feel like Countercatcher fits in really nicely with this archetype, where you are often using Abyss Seeking into opponents, or even just leaving Comp Phase out in the active and sort of giving the tempo to the opponents more often than not. But having a Countercatcher in your list means that you can be targeting the most important Pokemon on your opponent's side of the field for a prize race, or just taking away pieces of their engine whilst using Colress on turn 2. I think that's why we've seen things like cross switches in Tina in recent times, is because it really hurts when people are putting their ideal Pokemon in the active position against a Tina, knowing that the Giratina player has to Colress on the following turn to reach Mirage Gate numbers to actually start launching some attacks. Now that you have Countercatcher in the deck list, that completely changes what Giratina is capable of in terms of what it's targeting down on that second turn of the game. So I think this is a massive item for Tina. Could even be a 2 count in the deck list, because I think it's so valid. Could completely replace Boss's Orders. I think it has that much potential. Puts Boss down to a 1 count, and then you have 2 counts Catcher, giving you effectively more Gust in Giratina right now, but gives you just so many more lines of play from that second turn of the game, where you have so many ways of making comebacks in the game, which is excellent. And then Roaring Moon, it may look a little out of place here, but go with me in that it could be completely replacing Giratina as forming its own new Lost Zone archetype, where we're playing Psych Energy and Dark Energy in the deck list, knowing that this can be a gate attacker in its own right, where it has, very similar to Giratina, a 1-hit KO option, but also has that Calamity Storm option, which again is just very solid for hitting that 220 threshold. So it might end up being a completely new build of Lost Zone built around Roaring Moon, because the card is just so dang strong. And pairing Roaring Moon with some other fantastic single prize attackers in Cram for early tempo, or Sableye for mopping up damage across the board to put you in range of Calamity Storms, or just dealing with other Pokemon on the board, could be an excellent way to go in the game, especially because we know that Dark typing is still so favourable. I personally think that Lost Zone Giratina is going to survive pretty well, but there are still these threats that we have to talk about. Jirachi, of course, ruining the game plan of us wanting to Sableye over and over again, which is a bit of a headache. And if we are going to be concerned about these Rapid Strike combo Iron Valiant builds, or if we're going to start seeing Xatu builds of Valiant, which I personally think we will see these builds, they're going to be a challenge for Comfey engines because they have such low hit points. So we're definitely going to have to pack our own Jirachi and hope that that's going to keep us in games. But we still know that Valiant can be taking multi-prize turns against us at times and can make the matchup pretty foggy for us. On to Chen Pao Baxcalibur. I feel like this is the archetype that has the most hype going into this set because it seems like a really good partner with Iron Hands EX. The Earthen Vessel is a fantastic item to add into the deck, and we already play Irida in really high counts and Pokestop, so we have great ways of accessing the Earthen Vessel early, which can give us really easy access to our Lightning Energy, especially with sort of mid to late game options with the Superior Energy Retrieval. We have a 4 energy attack cost with Iron Hands, one of them being a Lightning that can be our turn attachment. We can easily fulfill that with a Superior at any point in the game, so an Iron Hands can be burst onto the scene out of nowhere with this archetype, and suddenly we have so many ways that Chen Pao can reduce the game down to 4 turns in the ideal scenario, where you take a turn to build your board, turn 2 you go Baxcalibur, you're either attacking a single prize Pokemon with Iron Hands and taking 2 prizes, or you're taking a trade with Chen Pao 2 for 2, or ideally, you know, 3 for 2 if you're into VMAX matchups, and we're not really going to be slowed down because we have ways of using cross switches with Iron Hands to take multi-prize turns, or we have Chen Pao knocking out the big stuff. So just having the combination of Chen and Hands means you're basically never going to be denied multi-prize turns, similar to how we've seen the cross switch Cologne package. However, it seems much more straightforward to have the Iron Hands in here because Earthen Vessel is just a naturally good card compared to Cologne, which is like a brick, whereas Earthen Vessel is at least getting you drawing with Greninja and is helpful even when you're attacking with Chen Pao, that sort of thing. And Iron Hands being a Pokemon is much more searchable than the Cologne, even in a deck like this where you have so much item density with Pokestops and you have Irida. They end up being pretty similar actually in searchability, but the idea is we can reload Iron Hands with the natural 2 Super Rod that's already in the deck list. It's really not too much change for Chen Pao, which is already a fairly well-performing deck. I think most people put it in the sort of top 6, top 7 of archetypes in the game right now, and now it gets a huge buff with Iron Hands. Quick note on Counter Catcher as well. We know that people are going cross-switching and it's a big combo, but again, Counter Catcher could just be a big card in the deck. We have Irida, we have item density. The card's just so good that it could end up being in all sorts of archetypes, and I'm never really going to bat an eyelid because this is a setup deck at the end of the day. You always give up 1 turn to the opponent, so anyone can initiate a race against you. Suddenly you have a Counter Catcher springboard back into the game, whether it's with Iron Hands or with Chen Pao, could be really helpful for you rather than having to rely on getting double crossies to be hitting the thing that you really want to on that turn. The one dampener I am going to put on Chen Pao is that it does struggle against these Valiant variants. You often have 60 hit point Frigies because they have 1 retreat cost, and you often have 60 hit point Bidoofs because they naturally protect themselves against sniping, and also they also have 1 retreat cost. So the optimal basics for Chen Pao really plays into the hands of Tachyon Bits and Yoga Loop and all that sort of thing. You really don't have the board space to be playing Manaphy and Jirachi, so even if you want to have those tech cards, it makes your board terrible, and it means you're going to be doing nothing from turn to turn because you won't really draw enough cards to make the combos happen for the Chen Pao deck. So I feel like if we are seeing way too much Chen Pao Baxcalibur, the easy sort of response is that Iron Valiant EX variants will completely demolish these board states quite easily because 60 hit point Pokemon are just so fragile, and even just taking out a Bidoof early is so backbreaking for Chen Pao because it's so specific in what it needs to draw to actually get going on that turn 2. It's not just getting your candy backs, it's also finding a ton of energy. Sometimes you need to get your tech attacker into the mix or find your cross switchers, that sort of thing. You need so much, and oftentimes that's off the back of a barrel, sometimes even double barrel in the best case scenario. So even if the Frigie's not being dealt with immediately, sometimes Bidoof's getting Yoga Looped and they're taking out another Pokemon on the following turn, and Iron Valiant decks can just definitely get ahead in a race, and if Valiant gets ahead, it's not really going to slow down because the Chen Pao archetype doesn't really have high hit point Pokemon. Its highest hit point Mon is the Iron Hands itself, and that can easily go in range of a Valiant, especially if they're using the Future Booster capsule, because then they're hitting that 240 just with 1 Tachyon Bits. So I feel like although Chen Pao seems to be the best partner with Iron Hands, I do think in this set we get a really good response to the archetype in general because it's just so fragile and so focused on their lower hit point basic Pokemon. Finally then, I've already kind of bigged up this archetype, but I do think Iron Valiant is going to be a great combination with Rapid Strike. I think the sort of toolbox that we know of with Octillery and Inteleon might be completely brushed aside for a much more low to the ground. Urshifu is the best attacker that gives me spread option, Give me Yoga Loop because it's busted, especially alongside Tachyon Bits. Let's have a Squawkabilly in there. Let's go wide with our Valiants, and let's just attach our Rapid Strike energy throughout the game and give ourselves attacks from that direction. I found it pretty powerful in our early game testing. Yes, it's combo based. Sometimes it will fizzle, but I feel like it really does put a dent into most evolving archetypes. Even if they do end up getting a setup, you just get ahead enough in a race and you pick apart key pieces of boards that your opponent ends up being pretty well disrupted and end up having less than ideal turns 2 and 3 after you've taken a few things off the board. Jirachi, of course, is going to be a big tech card to at least deny early, like turn 2 Yoga Loop plays. But Jirachi itself only has 70 hit points. It can easily go down, and then the floodgates once again open for this archetype to get really nasty with its spreading options. So I do think I Am Valiant EX is going to be the premier way to be playing the Rapid Strike deck in the future formats. The one thing I will say, however, is that if we do want to continue playing a pure toolbox with Octillery and with Urshifu, there could actually be a new direction for the archetype where, once again, Arven is just the guy. The amount of TMs from this set really make the supporter very, very powerful, giving Rapid Strike a TM evolution, immediately allowing you to get into an Octillery and an Inteleon VMAX, or just protecting a ton of attachments onto your Urshifu by going immediately into a VMAX yourself alongside an Inteleon or something like that, could be absolutely massive to just make this board state get developed on that turn 1 going second. You go Arven, you get VIP plus Evolutor, you get that attachment, so you suddenly get 2 stage 1s ready to go for the following turn. It seems just so powerful. I really feel like the TM evolution is going to be a big card in the game, and I think if we do want to still see the double gunner build, this could be a really big card. At the same time, I've just mentioned how good it is to have the Arven package. Now, Devolution is also a fantastic technical machine we could be using to, again, completely wipe away board states from opponents, where we're going to be gunning down all sorts of things, using our Radiant Alakazam to put the counters exactly where we want to. We could end our turn on a Devolution. Suddenly we pick up a ton of things like Charmanders, Pidgeys, even like Bibarrels, Guardy pieces, of course, and you just completely sweep the rug from under the opponent because you've taken multi-prize knockouts and made it very difficult for them to really construct anything on the following turn. Also, the Rapid Strike box plays no Gust whatsoever right now because it doesn't really have the room to boss, but a Counter Catcher could work really well in either an Arven or an Irida build because it's a fantastic item for you. You can really be in control of where your prizes come from and when you want to take them, so you can really sit on the back foot as this archetype in terms of a prize race, knowing that you're building up damage counters throughout the entire game, and having a Counter Catcher can be really a great new option in the archetype to structure your prizes more effectively, especially into Terrestrial EX Pokemon, because they of course can't be targeted from the bench, so bringing back a Charizard that you've heavily damaged or bringing back any of these new Terrestrials like Garchomp could be massive for you to be able to finish those Pokemon off. The new threats for Rapid Strike, as I've said, you want to be Yoga Looping. That's one of your most powerful plays available to you, and Jirachi simply says no to Yoga Loops, so it's going to be important to play around this sort of card. It does feel really good as a Rapid Strike box player, though, if someone is going to commit bench space to both Manaphy and Jirachi. That's 2 low hit point Pokemon that you could cash in on during the game, even just with a variety of double gunners, rather than just having to Yoga Loop them themselves, so it could end up being just pretty okay for Rapid Strike, to be honest with you. The other thing that's a concern is that you have 2 really crucial weaknesses to both of the future Pokemon. Iron Hands is really good into Inteleon and, of course, into Octillery for a true prize turn. And there's I Am Valiant, which, if it's attacking in like a Xatu-based build, can one-hit KO your Urshi. So I am a little bit concerned that there could be some more big weaknesses in the game that Rapid Strike has to play around, but that hasn't really stopped Rapid Strike. You know, we've seen that Urshi's always had some psychic things to compete with, and there's already currently lightning decks in the game, and it's not really putting Inteleon off too much. They do seem to play well into each other in terms of covering for their weaknesses. You simply attack with the other VMAX Pokemon in those sorts of situations, so it may not be a huge issue. And I do feel like there could still be some double gunner based builds. The I Am Valiant is a big wombo combo, but with a new Arven package, I feel like you just kind of get there a little bit more with the traditional Rapid Strike build, and I think that's also super appealing. So that's a ton of information, just a few things to end on really from my early playtesting. The first of which is a general rule of thumb, and this is in Game 1 scenarios when you're going second, especially if you're playing evolving decks, make sure you're playing your basics out of your hand. Make sure you have multiple Pokemon in play, because we have to really respect that Iron Valiant could simply sweep the game away from you before you even draw a card. Genuinely, I'm terrified of this. I feel like there can be wombo combo decks out there that can make this happen. I know it's a lot to get going, you know, they need to find a ton of ropes, a ton of switch carts, this, that, and the other to actually get the Iron Valiants into play to deal that 70 or 60 damage or whatever, but it can be done. We have Forest Seal Stone, we have Squawkabilly, we have Trekking Shoes, we have Pokestop, we have so much dig in the game right now that it's genuinely viable for archetypes to attempt this against you. So it's really important to put down multiple Pokemon so at least you get to draw a card in the game to actually play it, because otherwise you could get donked if you had weak starts, which is pretty terrifying if you ask me. In the current format, the only reason you would put more Pokemon into play was to play around Grabber from like Mew builds, but right now it feels like with Iron Valiant possibly being a big archetype in the game in either the Rapid Strike variant or an Xatu variant, it feels really important to put multiple Pokemon down. So that's the first rule of thumb that you have to really bear in mind in the Paradox Rift meta. The next one I want to say is that evolving decks probably need to play Jirachi and Manaphy in the new set. That's so that you protect yourself from the Yoga Loop plays, but also it's a really nice tech for Sableye, right? That's been one of the issues with Guardy, one of the issues with Charizard, is that Sableye can get really sneaky and make things really awkward for you. And, you know, to an extent as well, Rapid Strike was an awkward deck where there was the Yoga Loop opportunities for them, so having that extra safeguard is really helpful. And the other thing I want to say, even though there is big threat with Iron Valiant archetypes out there, I do also think that the Arven approach of both, you know, Gardevoir, Goldengo, Charizard, so many decks want to play this Arven package because the TMs are busted for so many of these decks. Plus, we have Forest Seal Stone. There's so many ways to weave this in. And deck building wise, Arven seems to be one of the best going second supporters we can play now, because it's getting you guaranteed tutor of VIP pass, but then also your evolutions immediately. And in the game, we are really suffering for evolution search. You know, we have like the supporter that's Jacques, which is terrible in so many situations. We have Ultra Ball, which is great, but you can only play 4 of them. And then it's like capturing Aroma. So now that we have the Evolutor, it's massive. I really think it will change how evolving decks are built in the future. Outside of that, Roaring Moon seems to be a really good racing archetype. It just seems to be low to the ground, consistent, has beat stick potential. I think it's no-brainer that it's going to be one of the top decks in the game, because it's just a very good racing deck and is very consistent at what it is trying to do, and it has really high stats. You know, the 230 threshold is big, the 290 threshold is massive when you are putting an Ancient Booster Energy Capsule onto the card. You can even attack with Brute Bonnet to offset the prize race. It's really good at getting through other single prize Pokemon, and it also helps Roaring Moon push to 110 without discarding a Stadium, or 230 when you are discarding a Stadium with Calamity Storm. So now Roaring Moon is knocking out Iron Hands, it's knocking out Dragonites, it's knocking out other Roaring Moons if they haven't got a tool attached to them. So yeah, I think this could be a really good archetype in the game, and I think this might be a number of players' comfort picks going into LAIC actually, because you don't really have to worry too much about the Iron Valiant wombo combo decks too much. You don't have to worry about Iron Hands so much either. Maybe a little bit, because you're probably still playing Squawkabilly and you're still probably playing like Radiant Greninja and stuff. So there is some issue there with Iron Hands in general, but just the fact that you have these chunky 2 prizes, you're a fairly straightforward archetype, and the attacks are just so good on this attacker that I would not be surprised if Roaring Moon is the most played deck at LAIC. That's my hot take for this video right towards the end, if anyone's still listening. And the last thing I want to say is really just touching on Iron Hands. It's kind of impossible to ignore that this has got so much discussion around it. I've heard everything from Iron Hands is mid to Iron Hands breaks the game, and I think it's somewhere in between. I think it's very versatile. It could make its way into so many decks, and you can't really question the fact that it ends up being in there, because it's a great card for just evening up a prize trade or giving yourself an easier map. If you don't have Boss's Orders in hand, you can dig through your deck with draw supporters, find a way to use Iron Hands, and still have a means of keeping in a race. And I think, you know, its type coverage is solid for the 2 prize Pokemon like Glaminion, Pidgeot, and Squawk, that it could have a ton of value, and it's great for getting through single prizes. I do think it will be shaking up the game, but I don't think it's going to be the apocalypse that some people have made it out to be. It's going to be a very powerful card. It's going to go into a ton of archetypes, yes, but I don't think it is so warping that there are just archetypes that are no longer good, full stop. I think there's still going to be plenty of good decks in the game, and ultimately it's going to continue to be relatively healthy. I'm honestly more scared of Iron Valiants making the game pretty bad in terms of putting me off playing evolution decks, because From what I've played so far, it's a scary archetype. Let me know your thoughts down below. Hope you enjoyed today's video. We're getting on to some IRL gameplay from tomorrow. Our set reviews in a couple days' time. The buy list is coming soon as well. So we're completely focused on Paradox Rift from now on. I hope you're all as excited as I am for this set. And yeah, stick around for some more videos tomorrow. Cheers.